So I started off today's practice with a puzzle that I thought would be relatively difficult. It is African Elephant, a 500-piece puzzle by Ravensburger. Since the color palette was almost all brown, I expected it to be pretty difficult. So I did decide to start out by sorting out the edge pieces, thinking that would at least give me a way to start off building the puzzle. I also was able to quickly pick out the brown grass at the bottom, so that's the first place I went with. As you can see, the border came together pretty quickly, and then I also realized that the orange part of the sky was fairly easy to pick out, so that's what I worked on next. It was a pleasant surprise to realize that building the sky was very similar to some of the gradient puzzles I'd been doing recently, and I actually had a lot of fun building a sky section. There are not a lot of features in this puzzle, so I started building the tree on the left because I could actually identify those leaves fairly quickly. I started pulling out some of the elephant pieces to the bottom right, because even though everything was brown to begin with, I started being able to distinguish the elephant texture from everything else. At this point, I decided to pull out all the sky pieces so I could treat it as a gradient puzzle. I could tell that the top left was more red and the top right was more yellow, with a dark gray cast across the entire top band. Because of how subtle the color variations were from each other, I found I needed to position myself directly over the puzzle for most of that section. After I got through the top 2 or 3 rows of the puzzle, I realized it was going much slower for me, so that's when I think I switched over to working the elephant. I started pulling out the boundary between the sky and the elephant and working on the hard shadows of the legs. Again, since the elephant wasn't that big a portion of the puzzle, it turned out to be easier than I expected. The only parts I really had trouble with were the shadows in the ear and the bottom part of the trunk. Finally, I returned to the remaining parts of the sky. Thankfully, I didn't have to resort to shape sorting, as there was still enough of a color gradient to distinguish where to put the pieces. Even though my final time was over an hour, I'm still quite satisfied. Now for puzzle number 2. This is Quirky Dogs, another 500-piece puzzle by Ravensburger. This puzzle was a completely different story. Right off the bat, I knew this was going to be a difficult puzzle for me. It is the kind of puzzle we refer to as a busy puzzle. There's a ton of detail in the image, and a good visual memory is very important to avoid having to spend a lot of time studying the box over and over. Unfortunately, visual memory is not my strong suit, so I'll spend a lot of time finding something in the image, and then 5 minutes later forgetting where I found it. So as you can see, I did start out with the edge on this puzzle, because I figured the more pieces I could put together, the better. I have a small section of red pieces sorted out to the right side, and a bunch of green pieces in the center, because I had a lot of trouble in the beginning deciding what to work on. Nothing I pulled out seemed to go together. This was mostly because the red and green portions of the puzzle were only small patches scattered among the dogs. And the interesting thing about this particular image is that all the dogs on there appeared 2 or 3 times. So I found myself having to build identical patches of dog side by side before I could determine which was placed in which position. The next color I started working on was the white pieces. I have found in the past that it helps me to focus on small patches at a time. Unfortunately for this particular puzzle, 6 similar looking white dogs is about the best I can do when it comes to narrowing things down. I was closing in on the 1 hour mark, and I had much less of the puzzle done than I usually do. I knew for sure that this was a very difficult puzzle for me. The next thing I pulled out were the black pieces. I don't normally like working on black pieces because I feel like they have so little features in them, but they actually stood out more against the brown in this case. Now that I had a much better understanding of the layout of this image, I finally started placing those red pieces that I pulled out right in the beginning of this puzzle. Since most of the other colors were already placed, I started being able to distinguish between different shades of brown. So the next color that I worked on was the tan. And then now I started working on the light browns, and then followed by the medium browns. I usually leave dark colors to the end, and this puzzle was no exception. Again, busy puzzles like this are kind of my nemesis because I don't remember images very well. So for example, I may have early on placed some pieces with the dogs with blue eyes, and then 10 minutes later in the puzzle, I'm searching for the same dogs with the blue eyes because I don't remember where I put those pieces. But then every other competitor has their own strengths and weaknesses, and I can only hope that my own strengths are strong enough to overcome my weaknesses. And pray that I don't receive a busy puzzle in my round like I did last year. At this point, I was wondering if shape sorting might help me a little, but this puzzle had gone on so long I just wanted to get it done and didn't want to stop to do that. It turned out okay, but I do think I could have done a lot better on this puzzle.